everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. Good morning to those on the West Coast, and good evening to those of you joining us from the UK and Istanbul. It's so good to have you for our third and final class of our three-part series on Turkish synagogues and the politics of conservation with our friend Kenan. Just a reminder, this program has been through the Sephardic Digital Academy, our online learning database, hosting all sorts of educational programming, all for free, on Sephardic history, culture, Ladino language, Sephardic Torah classes, Sephardic Jewish perspectives on philosophy, and so much more. If you're interested in learning more about our other programs, if you haven't seen any of them before, or if you missed a program and wanted to catch up on it, you can go to our website at sephardicbrotherhood.com/Sephardic Digital Academy. Now, without further ado, I'm going to hand over the floor to Kenan, who is a master's student at Oxford, studying, particularly focusing on Turkey's minority communities and also the Jewish community in particular, and has been an expert himself in learning Ladino and writing in Ladino as well, which has been really wonderful to have as an asset to the community. Without further ado, Kenan, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Ethan, for your warm regards once more. Hello, everybody. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas, de nuevo. Hoş geldiniz. Let me just share my screen real quick. Hope you're all fine today. And without further ado, let's just begin. In today's final lecture, I'm going to be talking about the Juderias of Turkey. Juderia is the Ladino or Judeo-Spanish word for Jewish neighborhood, quarter, or mahalle in Turkish. I'm sure the word will sound familiar to those of you who speak Portuguese or modern Spanish. As you can imagine, the Juderia was traditionally the focal point of Jewish life within a city, where the community would coalesce and where synagogues, schools, yeshivas, and other institutions such as hospitals, charities, and businesses would all be located. Today, I'll be looking at three Juderias in specific: the two Golden Horn neighborhoods of Balat and Hasköy in Istanbul, as well as the Kemeraltı district in Izmir. So Istanbul is here, just to give you guys a picture, and Izmir is over here, both cities in Western Turkey. These three Juderias are united by the fact that they are all home to centuries worth of invaluable Jewish history and heritage, despite the fact that there are no active Jewish communities residing in these quarters in the present day. I'll begin by giving a brief overview of these three Juderias, starting in Istanbul and then moving on to Izmir. I'll briefly go over the rich Jewish cultural heritage in these neighborhoods, focusing on the active synagogues, as well as the ones that have become abandoned or ruined in the past few decades. Finally, I'll discuss the future of these three neighborhoods by comparing the impressive conservation efforts taking place in Izmir with the present-day condition of Istanbul's Juderias. After discussing the ambitious Izmir project, I'll conclude the presentation with an overview of the future challenges in preservation and conservation that these neighborhoods face. First, however, I want to go over some useful sources again. So The Architecture and Memory of the Non-Muslim Quarter in the Mediterranean City is a great book that documents various non-Muslim neighborhoods, Jewish or Christian, in former or current Muslim Mediterranean cities from Morocco to Turkey. The one chapter that is based in Istanbul looks into the neighborhood of Balat and details the history of the neighborhood from pre-Ottoman times up until the present day, documenting the synagogues, the churches, and other non-Muslim heritage sites in the city. The Jews of Ottoman Izmir by Dina Danon, it's also behind me right now, reconstructs many elements of Sephardic Jewish life in the late Ottoman era, looking into class, poverty, and the many dynamics that shaped the community from the 17th century up until the early 20th century. Next, Ender Hassan's Memoirs, available in English and Turkish, offer a deep non-academic glimpse into contemporary Jewish life in Izmir, as well as Ankara and Eskişehir. There's also Bünyamin Levi's book, which is unfortunately only available in Turkish, called Bizans'tan Günümüze İstanbul Karaileri, which is perhaps the best source, or at least it's the best source that I've come across, on the long history and present-day status of Istanbul's Karaite community. A minority within a minority, the Karaite community in Istanbul today is composed of less than 30 people. The community still maintains a synagogue in the neighborhood of Hasköy that we'll look at later. Later, there is the next book by none other than Rıfat Bali. Again, it's only available in Turkish. It's called Aliyah, Bir Toplu Göç'ün Öyküsü, which documents the major Aliyah movements that took place from Turkish cities right after the establishment of the State of Israel. Many of the Jews who left Turkey in this period were impoverished, and they migrated to Israel or elsewhere, directly from the neighborhoods we will be looking at today. It was partially as a result of this migratory wave that many of the synagogues we'll be looking at ended up becoming abandoned. Next, we have two theses that are available in Turkish online. One is by the wonderful İnci Türkoğlu. It's her doctoral thesis on the synagogues of Turkey and the architecture of these synagogues. and the other one is by Muhammed Jihad Kına over here, which looks at the neighborhood of Pascay and the synagogues in the region, especially the Abu Dharra Synagogue and the restoration plans for this synagogue. Once more, Naim Güleryüz's book on the synagogues of Turkey was very helpful in my preparation for today. And finally, Años Muchos y Buenos by Laurence Salzman and Ayşe Gürsan Salzman documents their travels through Turkey in the lead up to 1992. And there's also a fantastic accompanying documentary series that is available on Salzman's website. I'd be happy to share it with anyone who is interested. All right, so starting off with a map of Istanbul, I just want to show where the two neighborhoods in Istanbul, the two Juderias that we'll be looking at, are located. One of them, Balat, is over here on the Golden Horn, which is this estuary that links up to the Bosphorus, which is the strait that separates the European and the Asian sides of Istanbul. This part of the city is the historical peninsula where Constantinople was located with its city walls. And this is the first Bosphorus bridge. So there are other Juderias in Istanbul, like in Galata and in Kuzguncuk up here on the Asian side. But today I'll be focusing exclusively on Balat and Hasköy on both banks of the Golden Horn. The neighborhood of Balat, as I said, is located within the city walls of Istanbul on the historical peninsula. It is located in close proximity to the neighborhood of Fener or Fanar, that was traditionally majority Greek Orthodox and is home to the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Constantinople. The boundaries between these two neighborhoods are rather blurred, and traditionally associations with Balat or Fener were not necessarily topographic, but confessional. So Jews who lived closer to Fener would refer to themselves as Balatlı or from Balat, and vice versa. Balat was one of the first parts of Istanbul to be inhabited by Jews, and there's been a Jewish presence in the neighborhood for centuries, with successive waves of Romaniot and Sephardic settlement. For this reason, there's a significant number of synagogues in Balat that are named after cities or towns that Jews came from before migrating to Istanbul. The Jewish community of Balat itself was quite impoverished in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Multiple travel writers and historians have written detailed accounts about the impoverished and destitute communities of Balat. As a result of this poverty, many Jews from the neighborhood began to migrate to other cleaner, safer, and more modern neighborhoods in Istanbul, such as Galata, in this time period. Those who remained were mostly those who could not afford to leave. Later, with the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, a significant part of Turkish Jewish migration to Israel comprised of socioeconomically disenfranchised Jews from neighborhoods such as Balat and Hasköy, which we'll be discussing in a bit. As a result, in the decades following 1948, many of the synagogues in Balat that were suddenly left without active communities gradually fell into disuse, eventually becoming abandoned. Today, there are very, very few Jews who still live in Balat. The two remaining active synagogues in the neighborhood are kept active by a community of veteran Balatlys who return to maintain the synagogues of their childhood or family stories. Here's a map of the Juderia itself and its synagogues. So as you can see, Balat is over here. This is Lower Balat and this is Upper Balat. The historic walls of the city run along this trajectory. There's also one synagogue that's missing on this map, so that brings it to a total of 7. So without further ado, I'll begin with the Ahrida. The famous Ahrida Synagogue is one of the most well-known of Istanbul's synagogues. It's located in central Balat and was built originally by a community of Romaniot Jews from the Macedonian town of Ohri. Later on, as the Sephardic community became the dominant Jewish group in the city, the synagogue was converted into a Sephardic synagogue. It underwent multiple restorations throughout the centuries, most recently in the run-up to the quincentennial celebrations of 1992. This most recent restoration sparked quite a lot of criticism due to the methods that were used in the restoration, the style in which the building was restored, and the lack of consultation and collaboration with the community of veteran synagogue goers that kept and continue to keep the Ahrida active. So on the left, you can see the entrance to the courtyard. It's a big monumental gate. And on the right, you can see the entrance to the synagogue itself. Here you can see the interior. It's a classic Sephardic synagogue with the teva or the bima located in the middle. And here is a picture of the Torah Ark. Next, we have the Yanbo. The Yanbo Synagogue is located just a stone throw away from the Ahrida. It's a little bit smaller, but feels much warmer and much more intimate. It was established by Romaniot Jews once more from the Bulgarian town of Yanbo. And the synagogue's ceiling features beautiful paintings of the town. I may be biased, but from the synagogues in Istanbul that I've visited up until today, I do think that the Yanbo is definitely one of my favorites because of its untouched, unaltered, and authentic character. So on the left, you can see the entrance to the courtyard, and on the right, a picture of the interior. You can see the Azara, or the women's gallery, up here. And here on the ceiling, you can see depictions of the town of Yanbo in Bulgaria. Here's another picture of the ceiling, and you can see these beautiful paintings that have been untouched and unaltered by the forces of preservation. Next, we have the Chana Synagogue. Not many people know about this synagogue. It's located within a larger structure that is thought to date back to the Byzantine period. We don't know exactly when it was constructed, but there is a document that shows that it was sold to the Sephardic community by the Romaniots in 1663. It later became the headquarters of the local Bet Din, or rabbinical court. For this reason, the structure has several rooms, including a meeting room, a library, and a prayer hall. It maintained its function as a Bet Din until 1908, and today the building is unused and it's rarely opened on occasions for Jewish heritage tours. So this is the view of the synagogue from the street, and this is the view of the courtyard on the interior. The prayer room is quite small, as you can see here. Next, we have the Ishtipal Synagogue. The Ishtipal Synagogue is unique not just in Istanbul, but also Turkey as a whole, as it is a wooden synagogue. It was founded by Romaniot Jews, again, from the Macedonian town of Ishtip. It was built in 1694 and was used actively until the mid-20th century, when it was abandoned. A few years ago, in 2016, a religious ceremony took place in the Ishtipal Synagogue for the first time in decades. The synagogue is unfortunately usually closed to visitors. And right across the synagogue, there are two beautiful old houses that also belonged to affluent Jews who lived in the neighborhood. On the left, you see the gate to the courtyard, and on the right, you can see a picture of the synagogue that I took through a barber shop that's located right adjacent to it. And here are pictures of the interior, which is quite well kept. Next, we have the Castoria. I briefly mentioned the synagogue last week, and it was said to be established sometime within the rule of Mehmet II, or Mehmet the Conqueror, once more by Romaniot Jews from Castoria in present-day Greece. As I mentioned previously, the synagogue was illegally razed to the ground in the 90s to make room for a car park. The surrounding walls and the courtyard and the impressive gate were the only bits that were fortunately spared. Recently, excavation works were started by the Directorate General of Foundations, the Vakıflar Genel Müdürlüğü in Turkish, and remnants of the Midrash and synagogue buildings were found. In the years to come, these buildings will likely be reconstructed. Here is the monumental gateway, and here is a recent picture of the excavation works. You can see the foundations of the Midrash and the synagogue. Next, we have a synagogue that some of you may recall, but as today is very dilapidated. It's called the Selaniko Synagogue, or the Sigri Synagogue. As indicated by its name, the synagogue was established by Jews from Salonika, once more likely during the time of Mehmet II, or Mehmet the Conqueror. It was one of the biggest and most important synagogues in Balat, and was particularly famous for its Purim celebrations. This is because in 1893, one of the synagogue's walls collapsed on the eve of Purim, and miraculously, no one was injured. The synagogue was later restored in 1926 and was then used particularly on high holidays up until 1975, when it fell into disuse. Today, the dedication plaque that was once above the main door over here is no longer present. No one knows where it is. It was probably stolen. The ceiling of the structure is long gone, and all that remains are 4 dilapidated walls. The Directorate General of Foundations has recently restored several historic heritage sites in the area, and seeing as the Selaniko Synagogue is located right on the coastal road by the Golden Horn, in close proximity to monuments such as the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate, the Cathedral of St. George, and the Sveti Stefan Bulgarian Church, it is not unlikely that in the years to come, plans may surface for its restoration, hopefully. Here is a picture of the synagogue as seen today from the street. I took this from Google Maps. And here is a picture that I was able to find, although it's quite grainy, of the dedication plaque that was once located above the entrance. It says Selaniko Synagogue. Actually, it says Synagonu, which is an archaic way of saying it in Turkish. And here it says in Hebrew, Kal Kadosh Selaniko. Next, we have the Eliyahu Synagogue, also in Balat. There aren't many sources available about this synagogue. I first came across it a few years ago when walking around Balat. I noticed this tiny dedication plaque on the very dilapidated and unassuming front facade of the building. As you can see, it says in Hebrew, Kal Kadosh, Kuf Kuf denotes Kal Kadosh. It's an abbreviation, or Keilah Kadosha. And here it says Eliyahu, and then the year, which corresponds to 1896 or 1897. This is likely a restoration date and not the date of the synagogue's original construction. Today, it remains abandoned, as you can see from this image in Google Maps. Much of the original structure is probably gone. So in summary, here are the synagogues of Balat that still exist today in one form or another, the date of their construction, and their current condition. Unfortunately, only 2 are active today, although 4 remain intact. 3 are in need of conservation or restoration. Moving on to Balat, to the neighborhood to the neighborhood of Hascay. Hascay sits just across Balat, as we saw on the map, on the other side of the Golden Horn. Much like Balat, Hascay is also a traditional neighborhood for Jewish settlement in Istanbul, and it has been for centuries. For this reason, Hascay is home to one of the largest Jewish cemeteries in the city, as well as many synagogues, many of which are unfortunately abandoned or disused. Whereas Balat has become a popular tourist destination in recent decades, with many trendy cafes and restaurants opening up in recent years, Hascay has not had the similar urban transformation and remains quite isolated from the rest of the city. There have been several projects aimed at revitalizing this part of the city in recent years, such as the opening of the Rahmi Koç Museum, and there are also plans to convert a nearby Ottoman shipyard into a cultural center with museums and recreational spaces. However, this process is lagging, to say the least. These projects, though, could accelerate the revitalization of Hascay and encourage conservation projects in the neighborhood. Here is a map of the Juderia and its 7 surviving synagogues. As you can see, this is the Golden Horn, this is the waterfront park, and here is the iskele, or the little quay from which you can take a boat. And here are the 7 synagogues. I'll begin with the Malem Synagogue, which is the only active Sephardic synagogue in Hascay today. The Malem Synagogue was actually abandoned for several decades, actually, after most of the Jews migrated from Hascay to other Istanbul neighborhoods or to Israel. It was restored and brought back into active use in the early 90s, and since then it has served a community of veteran Jews from Hascay. On the left, once more, you have the entrance to the courtyard. On the right, the entrance to the synagogue itself. And here's a picture of the beautiful interior with the teva in the middle and the wonderful Torah ark. Next, we have the Karaite Synagogue. So this synagogue, officially known as the Bnei Mikra de Kushta Synagogue. So Kushta is a Hebrew word, a historic Hebrew word. Now it's quite archaic for the city of Istanbul. It derives from Constantinople. And the Bnei Mikra de Kushta Synagogue is usually referred to as the Karaite Synagogue, but that's its official name. It's the only Karaite synagogue in Turkey. The Karaites are a small Jewish community that see the Torah as the sole source of religious authority. As such, they are distinct from rabbinic Jewish communities, be they Sephardic, Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, or Romaniot, as they reject the Talmud and other forms of so-called man-made law. Istanbul has been home to Karaite communities since the Byzantine era, and it is likely that this synagogue was established in the Byzantine era as well. Nowadays, there are very, very few Karaite Jews left in Turkey, and the synagogue is opened only on particular high holidays. The interior is adorned with many beautiful lamps, as you can see here, and chandeliers. And in the Karaite tradition, shoes are taken off before entering the prayer space, much like in mosques. Next, we have the Esker Synagogue. As I mentioned last week, the Esker Synagogue is located just by the coastal park of Hascay. It was abandoned in the mid-20th century and was eventually converted into a restaurant and shisha bar. The municipality of Beyoğlu is working on restoring the synagogue and converting it into a library that is more respective of the building's history as a place of worship. These restoration works are currently ongoing. This is a picture of the exterior, and this is a picture of the interior, a very recent picture following the vacation of the shisha bar from the premises. Next, we have the Mayor Synagogue. Once more, you can see here, Kuf Kuf, Kal Kadosh, Mayor. The Mayor Synagogue was named after the island of Majorca in Spain. It was thus likely founded by Jews who came to Istanbul from Majorca following the expulsion from Spain in 1492. The synagogue was abandoned decades ago and was used as a factory and workshop for many years until it was selected as a site to be preserved in the run-up for Istanbul's selection as the European Capital of Culture in 2010. Restoration plans for the synagogue were prepared and the site was used for art installations and music concerts, but unfortunately the plans never ended up materializing and the synagogue remains abandoned today. This is a picture on the right of the synagogue's exterior as seen from the street. And here are pictures of the interior, which is surprisingly quite intact. You can see it has a wooden ceiling. On the left is the Torah ark, beautiful and ornate. And on the right, the picture is actually from the art installation that was set up in 2010 for the year of when Istanbul was the capital of European culture. It was an exhibit called Molecular Istanbul and had marbles of all sizes all over the floor of the synagogue. Next, we have the Dharra Synagogue, also known as the Parmak Kapı Synagogue in Turkish. This synagogue was used as a warehouse and workshop for decades following its abandonment, much like the Mayor. Despite this, its interior is still in relatively good condition. In 2017, following 60 years of disuse, the workshop was cleared and a religious ceremony took place in the building. Since 2017, the space has remained untouched, and there have been discussions about restoration and preservation, perhaps in collaboration with a local university or NGO. These are pictures of the exterior. This is the courtyard entrance. And on the left, you can see a picture of the synagogue while it was still being used as a workshop. You can see the workshop here and the niche where the Torah ark was once located, and Hebrew inscriptions on the wall. On the right, you can see a picture of the synagogue in 2017 when the workshop was cleared and when it was reused as a synagogue on one occasion. And I believe it remains in this form in the present day, awaiting restoration. We have two more synagogues left in Pascay. One is called the Kula Synagogue. This was home to a yeshiva on the entrance floor and a synagogue on the top floor. And it was actively used until 1948, when it began to be used as a storeroom for scrap iron and tin. Nowadays, it continues to be used as a small factory or manufacturing shop. There are no plans for its restoration, and I was unfortunately not able to find pictures of its interior. We have one more synagogue called the Senora. This nearby synagogue was constructed in 1660 and was used actively until it was abandoned in the mid-20th century. Much like other abandoned synagogues in Pascay, the Senora was used as a multi-purpose factory for many years. Unfortunately, there are no conservation projects that I know of for this synagogue. Here is another summary of the synagogues of Pascay: the Malem, the Karaite, the Esker, Mayor, Dharra, Kula, and Senora. The time of construction, most of them unknown, unfortunately, but likely the 15th or 16th centuries, and the current conditions of these synagogues. So, as you can see, the situation in Pascay is a little bit more dire than the situation in Balat, where at least 4 synagogues are in need of restoration. So as you can already deduce, the two Istanbul Juderias of Pascay and Balat had rather similar fates in that the majority of their Jewish populations left either to other parts of the city, other parts of Istanbul, in a lengthy process beginning in the late 19th century, or as a result of mass migration to Israel following its establishment in 1948. As the local Jewish populations moved to other parts of the city, migrants from other parts of the country moved into these neighborhoods. Balat and Pascay were first popular destinations for migrants from the Black Sea region, and later for Kurdish migrants from the south and southeast. Pascay, in particular, became an industrialized area with the opening up of many factories and workshops. Consequently, many of the abandoned synagogues in the neighborhood served and continue to function as homes to industrial or manufacturing businesses. Balat, on the other hand, managed to preserve its historic character to a greater degree, becoming a touristic hotspot. As a result of this gentrification, it is more likely that conservation projects to restore and rehabilitate abandoned synagogues will take place in Balat. Nonetheless, the preservation strategy, the future of the synagogues of Balat and Pascay remain uncertain, but as an indication of what is possible, it is worthwhile looking at the case of Izmir and the Juderia of Kemeraltı in particular. So that's going to be our main case study for today. So historically, this is a picture of Izmir. This is the historic Asansör, which we'll be looking at in a second, and the neighborhood of Karataş. Historically, the socioeconomic profile of Izmir's Jewish community has changed several times over the centuries. Whereas the community played a major role in the development of Izmir as a city of trade and commerce in the 17th century, but the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the community had lost much of its affluence and prosperity and fallen into poverty. By the time the first Alliance Israelite Universelle School was opened in Izmir in 1873, the perception of Izmirli or Smyrnite Jews from the West was that of a community of backwards, lazy, and poor Orientals. Dina Danon details the poverty that was prevalent in the community at that time. Here's a quote from her book that describes this poverty. One can say without exaggeration that 9 out of 10 Jews in the city are poor. It's only with great effort that they manage to feed their children a crust of bread. This is from a dialogue between two people discussing the Shoah team in the city. Much like the communities of Balat and Haskoy in Istanbul, come 1948, it was mostly the city's impoverished Jews that ended up migrating to Israel. Within the city, Jewish migratory trends reflected shifts in socioeconomic conditions, much like in Istanbul, but also like in other cities around the world, such as in London, where the Jewish community migrated from the East End to the suburbs in the Northwest, or in New York, from the Lower East Side towards Manhattan. Jews who traditionally lived in and around the first Juderia in the Kemeraltı district, which is over here, began to migrate towards the neighborhood of Karataş, which is down here, in the late 19th century, eventually constructing the beautiful Beit Israel Synagogue in the new neighborhood in the 20th century, in 1907, I believe. This neighborhood is now referred to as Izmir's second Juderia, and it is today home to 2 synagogues, a Jewish hospital, and of course the famous Asansör, a historic lift built also in 1907 by a Jewish businessman and philanthropist named Nissim Levy. Today, the lift is one of Izmir's most well-known landmarks, and the dedication plaque at the entrance in French and Ladino can still be seen today. Later on, the city's Jews migrated to the more modern neighborhood of Alsancak, which is up here, where the Shara Shamayim Synagogue was built in the 1960s. Here is a picture of the famous Asansör and the dedication plaque at its entrance. It says in Ladino, Asansör fraguado por Nissim Levy en el año, and then the year 1907. So the elevator was built by Nissim Levy in the year 1907. Much can be said about the different experiences of Jewish life in Izmir and Istanbul. Despite having a proportionally much smaller Jewish population today, it can be said that the Jewish heritage and culture is more visible in Izmir than it is in Istanbul. For instance, the famous and delicious, I must interject, and delicious Sephardic pastry known as boyoz has become synonymous with Izmir in the minds of the wider Turkish public. This is boyoz over here on the left. Similarly, there are streets in Izmir such as Havra Sokak, meaning Synagogue Street, and Dario Moreno Sokak, or Dario Moreno Street, named after the famous Turkish Jewish singer who lived in Izmir in the first half of the 20th century. Unfortunately, there are no streets that denote Jewish presence in Istanbul. This is a picture of Havra Sokak, and here's a picture of Dario Moreno Sokak, 2 streets named after 2 Jewish-themed streets, I should say, in Istanbul. There's also a city ferry named after Dario Moreno, and a tram named after the delicious boyoz, as you can see here. And here's a statue of Dario Moreno, also located in Karataş. I also should mention that Izmir is home to a Sephardic cultural festival that brings Sephardic culture to the mainstream, and it's organized by the local community, but it's open to the wider public. Returning to the 6 back-to-back synagogues of Izmir's first Juderia of Kemeraltı, here's once more a map. These are the 6 synagogues I'm going to be looking at today. There are 3 more in the neighborhood. This is the Bazaar of Kemeraltı, the former and current commercial hub of the city. And up here is the Izmir Agora, the ancient city of Smyrna, where excavation works are ongoing. It's a beautiful place. I'll begin with the Shalom Synagogue. The Shalom Synagogue, also known as the Aydınlılar Synagogue, was built prior to 1648. The earliest reference we have of the synagogue is in 1648, when it was in this synagogue that the Jewish community of Izmir was formally institutionalized, with Rabbi Joseph Eskapa as its first chief rabbi. Interestingly, its teva or bima is unique. It's not located in the center of the synagogue, as we said is usually the case in Sephardic synagogues, or at the front, as is the case with most modern synagogues. Rather, it's located at the very, very back, creating more space for congregants in the center. Here's a picture of the interior, and here is a picture of the the Teva. As you can see, it's at the very, very back of the synagogue. Here's the Torah ark on the right. It's a beautiful Sephardic synagogue. Next, we have the Algazi Synagogue. I like this picture on the left because you can see 3 different signs that were put up at different periods, probably in the last 40 years, that denote the synagogues. It's very Turkish. One sign wasn't enough. They had to have 3. The synagogue was named after the Algazi family who funded its construction. The synagogue is a typical example of classical Ottoman Sephardic synagogue architecture. This is the gateway to the courtyard. This is the synagogue itself. And here are pictures of the interior. The Teva is once more in the very center on a raised platform. Here are some details on the interior, these beautiful windows. Next, we have the Senora Synagogue right around the corner. The Senora Synagogue was named after Dona Gracia Mendes, a wealthy Portuguese Jewish woman whose nephew, Joseph Nassi, became an important figure in the Ottoman court, serving as a diplomat and administrator for Suleiman the Magnificent and his son, Selim II. The synagogue has a beautiful little garden, as well as a painting that depicts the synagogue itself in its interior. This is the entrance to the synagogue. This is the Torah ark. And here is the little painting just above the entrance that depicts the synagogue. I think it's quite nice that there's a little painting of the synagogue itself. Next, we have the Etzekheim. As I mentioned last week, the Etzekheim Synagogue is one of the oldest synagogues in the city of Izmir. It is thought to predate the arrival of Sephardim in the city and was used actively until recent decades. It's currently undergoing a restoration process that is set to end at some point this year. This is the interior. The Teva will be located here in the center once the restoration is completed. And this is the Torah ark. And this is the entrance to the synagogue that was uncovered during these recent restoration works. Up here is the Azara, or the women's gallery. Next, we have the Chevra Synagogue, also known as the Talmud Torah Synagogue. As you can see from these pictures, the Chevra Synagogue is unfortunately in dire condition. Its ceiling collapsed decades ago, and for a long time, its walls faced the same fate. Recently, however, with funds from the German embassy in Ankara, a temporary roof was built over the synagogue to prevent further degradation, and it's set to be restored by 2023. This is the Torah ark, or was once the Torah ark. You can still see some Hebrew inscriptions on either side, and this is the view from the street. This is what it looks like now with the temporary roof that was financed by the German Foreign Ministry, the German Embassy. Hopefully it will be restored soon. Finally, the final synagogue of the day is the Forestero Synagogue. It's adjacent to the Chevra Synagogue. They're literally back to back. It's also known as the Orachim Synagogue. It used to house foreigners or outsiders that had ended up in Izmir one way or another. It's been in a critical condition for decades, and all that has survived of the synagogue until the present day are the walls of the structure. Fortunately, funding from the EU Commission was recently secured for its restoration, which is also set to conclude by 2023. So here is a summary, here's another picture, and here is the summary of the Izmir synagogues, the Karaite Synagogues, the 6 ones in particular that are back to back and that are part of the Izmir project that I will just discuss. These are the time of construction of these synagogues and their current conditions. So fortunately, 3 are active and in use. 1 is in restoration, which will be finished within this year, and 2 more will hopefully be restored by 2023. So moving on to the Izmir Heritage Project, I wanted to start off with this image just to highlight the unique nature of the Karaite synagogues. As you can see, 4 of these synagogues, the Foresteros, the Chevra, the Algazi, and the Senora, are quite literally located back to back. There are 2 additional synagogues across the street, the Shalom and the Etzekheim, and there are an additional 3 stone throw away, 5-minute walk away from these 6. Those are the Portuguese Synagogue, the Bet Hillel, which is today a house museum, and the Bikur Cholim Synagogue. Just by Havra Sokol, which is over here, the synagogue street that I mentioned earlier, you can also see the Kestane Pazarı Mosque and the Shadırvan Altı mosques over here, which belong to the 17th century. And the only other place that I can think of with this many Sephardic synagogues in such close proximity to one another is in the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem, where there is a complex of 4 Sephardic synagogues, one of which is interestingly named the Istanbul Synagogue, because it was founded by Jews from Istanbul in the 18th century. The local Jewish community, understanding the importance and cultural significance of this unique legacy, initiated a conclusive project to rehabilitate and restore the synagogues of Karaite. Inspired by the model of several European cities, such as Prague, that were able to successfully preserve their rich historic Jewish heritage by means of an encompassing preservation strategy, the Izmir community decided to launch the Izmir project, with the overarching goal of transforming the Kemeraltı synagogue complex into a Jewish museum, in which the synagogues can continue to function while also becoming accessible to locals and tourists as a major cultural heritage hub in the heart of the city. The goals of this museum span well beyond the preservation of the city's Jewish legacy, with aims to becoming a major center for intercultural dialogue and a site for showcasing the history of Muslim-Jewish coexistence. Within the scope of this project, work has already begun in several of the surrounding synagogues. As I mentioned earlier, the Etzekheim Synagogue over here has been under restoration for a while now and is set to reopen soon. Furthermore, with the very recent initiation of the most recent leg of this project, the Hevra and Forestero Synagogues, located here and here, are also set to be restored by 2023. Sorry, there's quite some noise coming from outside. Naturally, as a city with such a profound Jewish history, Izmir is also home to a lot of tangible Jewish heritage beyond the buildings and structures constructed for and by the Jewish community. Within the scope of the Izmir project, many historical books and parohets, which are textiles that are used to cover the Torah arcs, are also being preserved and safeguarded. The future museum is set to be one of the most well-preserved Sephardic cultural complexes in the world, with permanent and temporary exhibitions presenting the tangible and intangible elements, including the music, the language, and the cuisine of Izmir Jewish culture to its visitors. The famous architect Daniel Liebeskind, who is known for designing Jewish museums and memorials around the world, from Berlin to all other cities in Prague, and most recently in Lisbon, has already expressed his preliminary interest in designing the museum complex. A number of stakeholders, public and private entities, the government and non-governmental organizations have participated in this project in one way or another. Local municipalities have previously restored a nearby synagogue, converting it into a house museum. The US and German foreign ministries have supported restoration works in one form or another. The local Jewish community, as well as Jewish foundations around the world, have also provided funding and support. Finally, the European Commission has undertaken the most recent major leg of this project by financing the future restorations of the Hevra and the Forestero synagogues. Several books on Sephardic culture and Jewish heritage in Izmir will also be published as part of this most recent leg of the project. Following the restoration of these synagogues, there are also plans on establishing Synagogue Square, a so-called Synagogue Square at the entrance of the synagogue, which is depicted here in this render. And this will be undertaken by the local municipality, the Metropolitan Municipality, as well as the Konak Municipality. So here's a rendering of what the synagogue complex will hopefully look like once it's complete. Here's a render of the inside, the interior of the Forestero Synagogue, hopefully after its restoration. As you can see, it will most likely be used to exhibit the parohets and the books and other elements of Izmir's Jewish history and heritage. These are a bunch of the stakeholders that I mentioned that have contributed to this project in one form or another, including local municipalities, the German and the US foreign services and embassies in Turkey, other local foundations, the European Commission, the Jewish community itself, as well as other development agencies within Izmir. The Izmir project is doubtlessly an incredible and impressive undertaking for a Jewish community that today numbers less than 2,000 people. It is a good example of how local, international, private and public stakeholders can come together in a major collaborative effort to preserve and revitalize invaluable cultural heritage. This project aims to present Izmir's Jewish heritage to the rest of the world, focusing on the coexistence of Muslims and Jews in the neighborhood of Kemeraltı, in Izmir and Turkey more generally. What makes the Izmir project more impressive is the fact that a parallel project has not developed or even been proposed in Istanbul, where there is a much larger Jewish community. Unfortunately, the Juderias of Pascay and Balat remain vulnerable and at risk. One of the main challenges facing the vulnerable Jewish cultural heritage in the Juderias of Istanbul is the lack of knowledge that many Istanbulites have of the city's multicultural past, its neighborhoods, its culture, and its heritage. Thus, projects aimed at raising awareness of this past could trigger a so-called explosion of memories, as a result of which discussions on urban development can be shifted to include a deeper understanding of non-Muslim cultural heritage as part and parcel of the city. Projects and events such as the European Capital of Culture have the potential to impact policy choices in terms of preservation and conservation. In fact, when Istanbul was designated the European Capital of Culture in 2010, plans were drafted specifically to highlight the city's multicultural heritage. Greek, Armenian, and Jewish sites were selected and restored as part of this project. Future conservation efforts, too, must incorporate local, national, and international actors and stakeholders. However, the responsibility for preserving and maintaining the Juderias of Turkey is a shared one. It would be unfair and unwise to expect the small Jewish communities of Izmir and Istanbul to undertake these endeavors alone. Rather, it is up to the wider non-Jewish public, civil society organizations, universities, municipalities, development agencies, ministries, including the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, as well as the Turkish state, to designate and preserve this shared legacy, highlighting its significance in the history of the country and recognizing its unique and distinct position in the urban fabric of Turkish cities. International institutions and organizations such as the European Union can also be important partners in these conservation efforts. Similar projects in cities such as Prague can offer a roadmap for future preservation efforts, and the Izmir project is certainly a major step in the right direction that can serve as a national model for the other Juderias in the country. That includes not just Balat and Haskö, but also the Jewish neighborhood in Ankara, for instance, or the Jewish neighborhood in Bursa. This brings me to the end of today's presentation and the end of this three-part series. Before taking questions, I just wanted to take a moment to thank Ethan and the Sephardic Brotherhood for this wonderful opportunity to present some of my research interests. It's been a fantastic and challenging academic endeavor for me, I can definitely say. The preparation of this series has taken a lot of my time. I've learned a lot, and I've also consolidated a lot of the knowledge that I already had in this process. I also want to say thank you to all the wonderful spectators who have accompanied the Zoom presentations, as well as those of you who have followed via Facebook or YouTube. Thank you also to all those who have emailed me with your wonderful questions, your feedback, and your kind regards. As I'm sure you can imagine, the preparation of this series took a lot of hard work and many, many long days in the library. As I'm a full-time student, I also wanted to share the link to my PayPal with you all in case you'd like to make a small donation to show your support for this series, as well as my future research projects. I'll also be sharing the link in the chat, and without any further ado, I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. My contact details are also on the screen. You can email me any questions you have. You can follow me on Twitter. I have an Instagram page called Turkey Heritage Watch as well, where I document churches, synagogues, and other non-Muslim sites throughout the country. Also, my blog, canancruzchile.wordpress.com, is where I share the articles and the research that I conduct. And without any further ado, if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Exactly, Baruch, as we say in Hebrew, also used in the Ladino language. Thank you so much, Kenan, for an excellent three-part series, and for all of you for joining us. If you have any questions, please enter them into the chat, and we'll get to as many as you can in the remaining time. Kenan, maybe you can comment a little bit first after this three-part series. What got you interested in this community? It's always very interesting being from the Sephardic community when we see people who are not necessarily grew up in the community getting more involved and interested in the history and the culture and the language even of the Sephardic Jewish world. So maybe you can speak a little bit to that.
It's a good question. I've asked myself the same question a number of times. Obviously, I don't come from a Jewish background, but I am half Turkish, half Portuguese. And when I first discovered the existence of Sephardic culture within Turkey, I was very much reminded of the language that Ladino reminded me a lot of the language that me and my parents would speak at home with my brother, which would be a little bit of a mixture of Portuguese and Turkish. We'd take a Turkish verb and conjugate it as if it were Portuguese. When I saw that this was a similar thing in Ladino, I got very interested in the language and I felt compelled to learn it. And I think Sephardic culture is very much a bridge between the Iberian Peninsula and Turkey, two places that I call home. I'm also very interested in other minority groups within Turkey. I think it's the loss and the transition of Turkey from a multicultural empire to the modern day nation state that it is resulted in the unmixing of peoples that once resided together in one form of coexistence. Some people might romanticize it too much, but I think it's very interesting, and there's a lot we can learn about this coexistence in the present day. So I think those were a couple of the reasons that sparked my interest.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I appreciate that. Another question here. In the long term, do you see yourself actually going into this field long term, maybe get a PhD or continuing on the path of Sephardic Jewish history in particular?
I definitely would love to do a PhD. I'm looking forward to applying to PhDs in the upcoming year. I'm not sure where, and I'm not sure what in particular. I don't think it would be particularly in the field of Sephardic studies. It will most likely be in Turkey studies, but I'm sure whatever research I end up doing will definitely involve a lot of Jewish things. I'm particularly interested in the way that the government and the state has recently and throughout history approached non-Muslim heritage in the country. So I'm looking, I would most likely want to focus on examining the political influence and the reasons that different political actors may have for conservation of synagogues or churches, Armenian, Greek, or Jewish heritage.
Question here. What do you see as the future for preservation of Jewish Turkic sites in Turkey in general, especially in communities like Edirne or Marmara or other hubs of Jewish life that no longer have a Jewish community presence?
That's a good question. So as you can see today, I'm mostly focused on two cities where there are still active Jewish communities. Unfortunately, in smaller cities like Edirne and Bursa, Adana, and Iskenderun, the Jewish communities are either tiny or have completely disappeared. So I think the preservation efforts in those cities have to include perhaps the municipality or the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, in collaboration with the Jewish community in Istanbul, which is the central community in Turkey. I think there has been a lot of progress in the restoration of synagogues in these far-flung parts of Turkey, Kilis and Gaziantep, for instance. But there is still a lot of work to be done. There's a synagogue, for instance, in Diyarbakir, in a town called Çermik, which is a beautiful old ancient synagogue that is unfortunately in a very dire condition as well, and will hopefully be restored in the future.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It looks like it's all the questions we have for right now, but I just want to thank Hanan again. Thank you again for doing this wonderful series and taking the time out to do it. I know this is never easy and it's a lot of work, so we really do appreciate you taking the time out to do this. And I thank you all as well for joining us some in the middle of the day. We really appreciate you coming out to this program. If you missed any previous programs, they are on our YouTube channel as well on our Facebook page. You can just go on Facebook and search Sephardic Brotherhood, and go on YouTube, youtube.com/Sephardic Brotherhood. And lastly, we are a nonprofit initiative. If you're ever interested in supporting our initiative or sponsoring a future class or series, please check out our website and consider making a donation. We greatly appreciate that. Without further ado, thank you so much again. I will say al vemos for now. See you all again soon. And merci mucho again to Kenan for you all for joining us for these last few weeks.
Thank you very much. Merci mucho. Al vermos.
Al vemos.